Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So for this video, I'm right here. I want to talk about Tim Scott and his interview on The View. During that interview, he was asked about past statements that he made about systemic racism. In particular, Sonny asked him about his past statement where he said something to the effect that he does not believe in systemic racism. She asked him if he even believes that systemic racism exists. And then she went on to talk about how exceptional African Americans that are in certain positions are an exception to the rule. And then she went on to lay out examples of racial inequality that continue to exist in our society. Problems such as disparities in housing, economic disparities, criminal justice disparities, and she talked about healthcare disparities as well. And she also mentioned that every time we have tried to fight for improvements in our community or advancements, we have had to deal with white violence in response to our struggle for human and civil rights. So, in response to that, um, Tim Scott basically talked about how he has a great problem with the idea that the only way that African Americans can be successful is if they are the exception to the rule. And he basically pointed out how that's dangerous, how that's offensive, and how it's disgusting that that's the only message that we have for our young people, that they have to be the exception to the rule. And then he went on to talk about how yesterday's exception is today's rule. And he cited all of these examples of progress that we have in the community. He talked about all these elected officials in different positions, even though Sonny had pointed out that there had not been a black senator elected in South Carolina for 114 years until Tim Scott was elected. She was using that to bring home the point that he is the exception to the rule. But he went on to say that, that he finds that kind of idea that, of exception to the rules as being something disgusting and offensive and stuff like that. And he talked about all these elected officials that had achieved certain things. And, he talked about the first black president, other black senators, and all these other black elected officials to bring home the point that there has been a lot of progress in American society, to bring home the point that, it's no longer the exception to the rule. We have all this advancement. And I noticed that a lot of these black conservatives, I mean, not just black conservatives, conservatives, period, in particular, white conservatives have been like characterizing this interview as if Tim Scott basically destroyed Sonny's arguments or her position and all that kind of stuff. And I just want to point out why I think that everything that Tim Scott said was wrong for the most part. I'm going to explain it. And, basically, no one is denying that there has been progress. No one's saying that we are still living under the same conditions as our elders and our ancestors. There have been great strides, great progress in this society, but that does not negate the fact that there is still a problem with systemic racism in American society. Pointing to some token examples of achievement doesn't eliminate the fact that we have massive disparities that continue to exist in every facet of life. And those disparities that we see are a direct result of systemic racism. And it's just a shame that you have, these Republicans who want to pretend like racism is a thing of the past simply because you have a few hand-picked Negroes in positions of leadership. And I'm not going to dismiss The fact that we have these elected officials, their role is very important. Uh, I can't say that it's inconsequential, but the fact of the matter is, just having black faces in high places doesn't, in and of itself, change the condition of our people. That doesn't mean that we don't have all these disparities that continue to exist in our community. And what I'm going to do is just cite a few statistics. I saw this report in the Washington Post, and I will post a link to that report from the Washington Post, and it cites all the sources for this statistical information. For instance, it mentions that black women are have 3 times the risk of pregnancy-related deaths. This article also pointed out how the infant mortality rate is over twice the rate for black people compared to white people. Black people have massive healthcare disparities that continue to exist in our society, where, we have higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of diabetes, asthma, and heart disease. That's what this article points out. It points out how the net worth of white households is now 10 times greater than the black household wealth rate. This article also pointed out how, white neighborhoods receive far more for their students' education than black neighborhoods or so-called minority neighborhoods. It pointed out how for every white student, they receive like $2,200 per student more than African Americans, and that was in the year of 2015 and 2016. This article also pointed out how the percentages of black people below the poverty line is 3 times that of whites below the poverty line. And then, this also points out how, the impact of redlining. Redlining that took place like 80 years ago, it points out how 3 out of 4 of those neighborhoods that were redlined still struggle today financially as a result of that legacy. This article further points out how the incarceration rates of African Americans is 5.6 times greater than that for white Americans. And it points out how that even though African Americans make up 12% of the population, we make up 1/3 of the inmate population. And this article points out the disparities when it comes to police brutality. It talks about how black people are killed by the police at more than twice the rate of white people. So, despite this rhetoric about, about America being this great land of opportunity and being a place where anybody can make it and all that kind of stuff, we have these disparities that continue to exist. These disparities that make it far more difficult for an African American to be successful in societies. And these disparities are not an accident. They are the direct result of a legacy of hundreds of years of black people being enslaved. It's a direct result of the legacy of Jim Crow, a legacy that, made it impossible for us as a collective to build the wealth that we need in our community because of practices such as redlining, because of segregation of neighborhoods, because of racially restrictive covenants. Black people were prevented from building wealth. And then you look at educational disparities, as I mentioned before. in terms of how much money is allocated to poor, struggling black neighborhoods compared to affluent white neighborhoods. In terms of the resources, how much equipment they have, how much, the student to teacher ratio, even in situations where you have integrated schools, African Americans are often tracked to lower level courses. They are, disciplined more severely than white students. So there are all these massive disparities, and no amount of parade of tokens will change that. None of that will change those conditions. Just being able to point to these Negroes in high places doesn't change the reality on the ground. It doesn't change the conditions alone that we face in struggling black communities. Those positions are noteworthy. I mean, they are something to be proud of, but they are no substitute for equality. They are like symbols of equality. They are symbols or tokens of what equality may look like, but they are not in equality in and of themselves, especially when you look at these horrific conditions that our communities face. All of these problems we talked about, police brutality, healthcare disparities, educational disparities, housing disparities, etc. And the list goes on and on. And it's just a shame that we have these elected officials, they get to these positions and they cannot even speak on race for fear of offending their white voters. And people like Tim Scott, I'm not surprised that he would say these kind of things. I mean, he is a man who represents one of the most racist states in the country. He's a man that represents the heart of the Confederacy. That's what he represents. So if he talks all this racial talk, if he wants to talk like a New Possibilities or anybody else, this speaking boldly about racial issues, he will not be elected. So he panders, he tap dances, he buck dances, he shines shoes, he says all the pleasant things to make these white people at ease, to make them comfortable, so that they can know that they got a responsible, good Negro boy in office. That's what he does. And we don't need that kind of leadership, really. I would rather have someone that was, blatantly racist than someone that pretends to be our friend, but they're advancing the agenda of white supremacy. And that's what people like him are doing. Anytime this man doesn't have a heart to condemn what Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, and then he actually defended this man. Basically talked about how he would, Ron DeSantis is challenging indoctrination of people. And, I just don't think that that's acceptable for a black man to basically co-sign this governor who tried to ban an AP course on African American history, who enacted a Stop Woke Act that's basically designed to gloss over the suffering and pain of black history and give us some whitewashed, sanitized fairy tale version of history. Yeah, so I could go on and on, but I won't. So those are my thoughts about that interview. It's just a shame that here we have, another one of these Negroes that doesn't have a heart to speak the truth about racism in America.